Richard, let's get to Yella. What do you think? Yella.
Saudi in a minute.
Sorry. I'm getting loopy tired, so it's really funny
You are losing
today.
it. Well, you're an easy audience. I can do this about anything. Yalla.
Like you said, Richard,
All
it is
right.
the like 3 a.m. bedtimes, and then the Salat Al Fijr woke me up this morning, which was
Oh, awesome.
not
Look at you.
great. Yeah, so
I know it's not great. I always love that sound, though. But yeah, you're right. It is not good. And if you're waking up to it, it's not a good thing. Um, Yellen number one, Saudi Arabia will make a deep cut to its output in July on top of a broader OPEC plus deal to limit supply into 2024 as the group seeks to boost flagging oil prices. Saudi's energy ministry said the country's output would drop to 9 billion barrels per day in July from around 10 million barrels per day in May, the biggest reduction in years. OPEC Plus has in place cuts of 3.66 million barrels per day, amounting to 3.6% of global demand, including 2 million barrels per day agreed last year, and voluntary cuts of 1.66 million barrels per day agreed in April.
yeah, Richard, what's interesting about this is I think when this was announced, reporters got to speak with Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz between dinner and dessert because he said, this is a Saudi lollipop. We wanted to ice the cake. We always want to add suspense. We don't want people to try to predict what we do. Of course, the Saudis and all producers hate speculators. He said, quote, this market needs stabilization. So, yeah, I mean, this was a surprise move or just a surprise announcement as well. There was that photo that came out of all the energy ministers leaving Vienna kind of together looking really happy. So I think the other producers are very happy, of course, with their lollipop. And I think Saudi Arabia is doing what it needs to do. What will be interesting, and there's no way we can kind of get to all this in the Yella segment, it's small, but it'll be interesting to see how buying will shift between China and some of these other big importers. Like, will they find the cheaper crude? I mean, like, is that going to change at all? I don't know. So this is just sort of interesting. Really an important story, but an interesting story as well.
And one we're going to have to see play out because we really don't know. You're right. The energy minister does not like, he's called out short sellers frequently of late. This is an interesting move. And the market a week later, has essentially shrugged it off. And that's in part because they don't know this was a cut for July. That can be adapted or changed. So it's sort of wait and see. Saudis, OPEC, it's in a tough situation. You've got a very difficult global situation. China is sputtering. It hasn't really come back. There's projections that the second half of the year the economy will improve, but there's sort of recession hanging over a lot of economies. You've got discounted cheap oil running around, Russian, Iranian, Venezuelan oil. It's all out there. And I think there's probably some stress between the Russians and the Saudis because, again, the Russians are taking some of these markets in Asia. One of the things that wasn't mentioned, and I think it's important for comedy and good feeling, among OPEC, is that the UAE finally got its quota raised by 200,000. It's been bucking for a larger quota. And also, you mentioned everyone smiling. I'm thinking Nigeria and Angola are probably not because they had their quotas slashed a little bit. And then that's largely because they simply can't produce to it. And they haven't been able to produce to it for some time. So it seemed like, it spiked a little bit and then it's back in that 76, 75, range. Saudis really want it to be 80 and above, and certainly above 75 if they can, but it keeps sort of, gliding down into the low 70s. So we'll see we'll see if this sticks. But again, we've talked about it before. Being an energy forecaster in this current environment has got to be one of the hardest jobs in the world.
Yeah, and Richard, you mentioned a sort of market's shrug to this news, there was also another muted reaction, which I think was interesting, which was from the US. You know, you compare it to like what happened in last fall,
October.
where that announced, yeah, October. I mean, that was, the US was pissed and they didn't really say anything. Now, of course, Tony Blinken, which is another great transition. Episode 90 is all about great transitions, Richard, and we'll get to this in a second. But Tony Blinken's in Saudi Arabia right now. There are other things that are a little bit more important to the US-Saudi relationship, I think, which is something we've been advocating for or wanting to see for a while. So that's cool. But there wasn't a Joe Biden comes out and says, hey, this is not cool. You know, this is just, it was interesting that they didn't really respond to it at all. So
agreed. Same thing in the April. You know, they had the brouhaha after October 2022, but then the raise and increase in April, no comment. Increase, the surpassed increase, no comment. And I think that's probably the best way to handle it.